Welcome to her journey, a story of a mother's love, betrayal, and strength. If you've ever been hurt by the ones you love most, this story is for you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and stay with me till the very end, because you won't believe how our journey unfolds. My name is Amara Genkins, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to walk away. If you've ever been taken for granted by someone you die for, if you've ever wondered what happens when unconditional love meets its breaking point, then this story is for you. But I warn you, this isn't just about forgiveness and healing. This is about what happens when a mother finally says enough. I remember every detail of that July 4th morning. At 58, I'd learned to appreciate the small rituals that gave life meaning. I stood before my bedroom mirror, carefully applying lipstick the color of summer roses, the same shade I'd worn to every important occasion in David's life. My silver hair caught the morning light, and I allowed myself a moment of vanity. I was still beautiful, even after all these years of struggle. The apple cinnamon pie sat cooling on my kitchen counter, its golden crust gleaming with the butter I'd splurged on for the occasion. David's favorite since he was 7 years old. I'd gotten up at dawn to make it from scratch, just like I always did, just like his grandmother had taught me before she passed. As I drove through the tree-lined streets of David's upscale neighborhood, I felt that familiar mixture of pride and melancholy. These weren't the streets of my childhood, where broken screen doors hung crooked and grass grew through sidewalk cracks. This was the life I'd dreamed of giving him, the life my sacrifices had made possible. David's house rose before me like something from a magazine. Colonial revival with perfectly manicured landscaping, a circular driveway that could fit 4 cars, windows that sparkled in the summer sun. Through those windows, I could see the party already in full swing. Red, white, and blue streamers everywhere, guests mingling with drinks in their hands, children splashing in the backyard pool. My grandson Ethan's laughter carried on the summer breeze, and my heart swelled. 6 years old, and already showing signs of the intelligence that ran in our family. Not that anyone would ever connect that intelligence to me, not in this crowd of successful people with their perfect lives and careful manners. I balanced the pie in one hand and pressed the doorbell with the other, preparing my smile. After 33 years of being David's mother, I knew exactly how these gatherings went. I'd arrive, be politely welcomed, spend most of my time in the kitchen helping Vanessa with things she didn't actually need help with, and leave early with a container of leftovers and a promise to do this again soon. But when the door opened, everything changed. David stood there in his expensive polo shirt and pressed khakis, looking every inch the successful businessman he'd become. But his face, God, his face when he saw me. It wasn't surprise or even annoyance. It was something colder. Something that made my stomach drop before he even opened his mouth. "Mom," he said, and that one word carried a weight that pressed down on my chest like a stone. "Hello, sweetheart," I managed, lifting the pie slightly. "I brought your favorite. I know I'm a bit late, but the lattice work took longer than I." "You weren't invited." The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually took a step backward, as if he'd pushed me. Behind him, I could see guests turning to look, drawn by something in his tone. Conversations were stopping. Children were still laughing somewhere in the distance, but the adults had begun to notice the drama unfolding at the front door. "I don't understand," I whispered. And I truly didn't. We'd spoken just last week. He'd mentioned the party in passing, the way he always did, assuming I'd be there, because I was always there. Because I was his mother. "Vanessa's mother is already here," David continued, his voice growing louder, more confident now that he'd committed to this course. "We don't need 2 mothers at the party. Please leave. Now." From somewhere behind him, I caught sight of Vanessa. My daughter-in-law stood near the entrance to their formal living room, wearing a white sundress that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Her blonde hair was swept into a perfect chignon, her makeup flawless despite the heat. And on her face was an expression I'd never seen before. Not smugness exactly, but something close to it. Something that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment. But David, I tried again, my voice trembling now. I'm your mother. I raised you. I said leave. His voice cracked like a whip, loud enough that the nearest guests definitely heard. A woman in pearls actually gasped. Don't make this more embarrassing than it already is. Embarrassing. That's what I was to him now. Not the woman who'd worked 2 jobs to keep him in school. Not the mother who'd sold her engagement ring to pay for his college textbooks. I was an embarrassment. The pie dish slipped in my hands, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I might drop it right there on his perfect doorstep. But somehow I held on, the way I'd always held on, the way I'd trained myself to do through 33 years of single motherhood. Through the doorway, I could see into their backyard where Ethan was playing in the pool. My grandson, God, how I loved that little boy, caught sight of me and waved enthusiastically, his face lighting up with pure joy. Grandma, he called out, starting to climb out of the pool. Grandma's here. David stepped forward, blocking my view, his body language making it clear that I needed to leave immediately. Goodbye, Mom, he said, and began to close the door. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, my entire world rearranging itself around this new reality. Then, drawing on some reserve of dignity I didn't know I still possessed, I straightened my shoulders and walked back to my car. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I'd seen Ethan's confused face, if I'd witnessed the guests whispering about what they'd just observed, I would have crumbled right there in the driveway. Instead, I drove home in silence, the radio off, the pie beside me filling my small car with the scent of cinnamon and broken dreams. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and ate a slice of that pie. It tasted like sawdust in my mouth, but I ate it anyway because wasting food was a sin I'd never been able to commit, even now. I raised him better than this, I whispered to my empty apartment. Didn't I? But as I stared at my reflection in the dark window, another thought crept in, one that would haunt me through the sleepless night ahead. Maybe I hadn't raised him better. Maybe I'd raised him to take my love for granted, to assume it would always be there no matter how he treated me. Maybe it was time for that to change. The next morning found me surrounded by ghosts. I'd pulled out every photo album, every scrapbook, every memento I'd saved from David's childhood. They covered my small kitchen table like evidence at a trial, and in a way, that's exactly what they were. Here was David at 5, gap-toothed and grinning, holding the Batman action figure I'd layaway bought for his birthday. I'd worked overtime for 2 months to afford that toy, coming home exhausted night after night to find him asleep on our second-hand couch, homework spread around him like fallen leaves. Here was David at 10, standing proudly next to his science fair project, a volcano that actually erupted, thanks to the supplies I'd bought with money meant for new winter boots for myself. My feet had been cold that entire winter, but his face when he won second place had been worth every frozen toe. Here was David at 16, posing in his cap and gown at high school graduation. I'd taken 3 jobs that final semester to keep up with all the senior year expenses, class ring, yearbook, graduation photos, the party afterward. In the picture, I stood beside him beaming, my face thin from the meals I'd skipped, my dress a decade out of style but carefully pressed and mended. And here was David at 22, college diploma in hand, standing next to the car I'd co-signed for despite having terrible credit myself. That car payment had meant ramen noodles for dinner 3 nights a week, but I told myself it was temporary. Once he got established in his career, things would get easier. They never did get easier. Not really. Looking at these photos now, I began to see patterns I'd been blind to before. In every single picture, I was the one reaching out, my hand on his shoulder, my arm around his waist, my face turned toward his with undisguised adoration. And David? David was looking at the camera, smiling for posterity, accepting my love as his due. When had that started? When had my devotion become something he expected rather than something he treasured? The answer came to me with brutal clarity when he'd met Vanessa. I pulled out the photos from David's engagement party. The one I'd thrown for them in this very apartment because they'd wanted something intimate and authentic. Vanessa had smiled prettily for the photos, but I remembered how her eyes had cataloged every piece of my mismatched furniture, every crack in my walls, every sign that David came from humble beginnings. Within a month of that party, my weekly dinners with David had become monthly. Then sporadic. Then non-existent. "She thinks you're too involved in our lives," he'd explained when I'd finally worked up the courage to ask. "She thinks it's not healthy for a married man to talk to his mother every day." I'd backed off, not wanting to cause problems in his new marriage. I'd bit my tongue when they moved to that expensive neighborhood without telling me. I'd smiled and pretended it was fine when they started spending holidays with Vanessa's family instead of with me. I'd convinced myself that this was natural, that all mothers had to learn to share their sons with their wives. But yesterday had shown me the truth. I hadn't been sharing David with Vanessa. I'd been slowly erased from his life, and I'd helped by stepping back every time she'd asked me to. Now, sitting surrounded by the evidence of my own devotion, I felt something crack open inside my chest. Not just hurt. I'd been living with that for years. This was something harder and cleaner. This was rage. For 33 years, I'd poured every ounce of my energy into raising David. I'd given him my youth, my health, my financial security, my dreams. I'd made myself smaller so he could be bigger. I'd sacrificed everything I was so he could become everything he wanted to be. And my reward? Humiliation. Rejection. The casual cruelty of a son who decided his mother was no longer worthy of basic respect. I stood up abruptly, sending photos cascading to the floor. For the first time in my adult life, I felt the intoxicating rush of righteous anger. It burned through my veins like fire, clearing away years of doubt and self-blame. David wanted to pretend I didn't exist? Fine. I could make that wish come true. I picked up my phone and scrolled to his number. For just a moment, my finger hovered over his name, 33 years of habit urging me to call, to apologize, to try to make things right between us. Instead, I pressed block contact. His number disappeared from my phone, and with it, 3 decades of unconditional availability. If David wanted to treat me like a stranger, I would oblige him. If he wanted to pretend his success was entirely his own achievement, with no debt to the woman who'd made it all possible, then he could live with that fiction. But living with it was going to cost him more than he knew. As I swept the scattered photos back into their boxes, I whispered a promise to my empty apartment. "You want to see what life looks like without your mother, David? You're about to find out." My phone started ringing at 6:47 a.m. the next morning. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee, watching the sunrise paint my small apartment gold, when the first call came through. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail and took another sip of coffee, savoring this new feeling of control. The second call came 3 minutes later. Different number, same result. By the time I'd finished my breakfast, I'd ignored 8 calls from various unknown numbers. It wasn't until Mrs. Chen from across the hall knocked on my door that I began to understand what was happening. "Amara, dear," she said, wringing her hands nervously. "Someone's been calling my apartment by mistake, asking for you. A young man, very upset. He said he was your son and that there was an emergency with his little boy." My coffee cup trembled in my hands. Ethan. If something had happened to my grandson. But then I remembered David's face yesterday, the coldness in his voice when he'd told me I wasn't welcome in his home. How convenient that there was suddenly an emergency, the day after he'd humiliated me in front of his friends. "Thank you for letting me know, Mrs. Chen," I said carefully. But I'm sure if it was a real emergency, he would contact the proper authorities. She looked uncertain, clearly troubled by the desperation she'd heard in David's voice. "He seemed very frightened, dear. Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I said firmly, and closed the door. By noon, my phone had logged 37 missed calls. By 3 p.m., it was 62. Each time it buzzed, I felt a little thrill of power. For 33 years, I'd jumped every time David needed something. Today, he was learning what it felt like to need someone who wasn't available. The calls kept coming throughout the afternoon, the numbers changing as David clearly tried every phone he could get his hands on. His office, Vanessa's phone, numbers I didn't recognize that were probably friends or coworkers he'd begged to help him reach me. With each unanswered ring, I felt myself growing stronger. This must be what it felt like to have boundaries, to say no, to refuse to be taken for granted. I'd never experienced it before. I'd been too busy being the perfect, selfless mother. At 6 p.m., a text message appeared from an unknown number. "Mom, please. It's about Ethan. He's in the hospital. I need you." My hands shook as I read those words. Every maternal instinct I possessed screamed at me to call back immediately, to drop everything and rush to help. Ethan was just a baby, my baby, even if David had made it clear I wasn't welcome in his life. I started to dial the number, my fingers moving automatically through years of trained response. But then I stopped. Yesterday, David had made it clear that I wasn't family. He'd chosen Vanessa's mother to fill that role, had cast me out with a cruelty that still made me flinch to remember. If Vanessa's mother was so much better than me, so much more suitable for their family gatherings, then surely she could handle this crisis too. I deleted the text without responding and turned off my phone. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing between worry for Ethan and fury at David. Part of me wondered if I was being too harsh, if my grandson was truly suffering while I played games with his father. But the larger part of me, the part that had been humiliated and discarded, refused to give in. David had made his choice. He decided I wasn't good enough for his new life, not refined enough for his social circle, not worthy of basic respect and consideration. Well, if I wasn't good enough to be invited to his parties, I wasn't good enough to solve his problems either. By the time I finally checked my phone the next morning, I had 99 missed calls. 99 times David had tried to reach me. 99 times he discovered what it felt like to need someone who simply wasn't there. As I stared at that number, I felt something I'd never experienced before, the satisfaction of watching someone else panic, someone else feel helpless and alone. For 33 years, I'd been David's safety net, always ready to catch him when he fell. Now he was falling, and for the first time in his life, I wasn't there. The lesson was long overdue. But as I made my coffee and tried to enjoy this new sense of power, one thought kept nagging at me. What if this really was about Ethan? What if my innocent grandson was suffering while I punished his father? I pushed the thought away. David had made this bed when he'd chosen cruelty over kindness, when he'd chosen Vanessa's approval over his mother's heart. Now he could lie in it. That night, sleep eluded me completely. I found myself pacing my small apartment like a caged animal, my mind churning with memories I'd tried so hard to forget. Memories of a discovery I'd made 3 years ago, a secret that had been eating at me ever since. It was Ethan's 4th birthday. Vanessa had called me, one of the few times she'd ever initiated contact, asking if I could babysit while she and David went out for their anniversary dinner. I'd been thrilled. Finally, an invitation to be useful, to spend time with my grandson in his own home. While Ethan napped that afternoon, I'd been tidying the guest room where old moving boxes were stacked. One had been carelessly sealed, and when I'd moved it, the contents had spilled across the floor. I'd scrambled to gather up the papers, trying to be respectful of Vanessa's privacy. That's when I saw it. Westside Medical Laboratory. The letterhead was unmistakable, and so were the results printed in stark black and white. A paternity test, dated just 2 months before David and Vanessa's wedding. The names were clear: Vanessa Morrison and Marcus Webb. The conclusion was even clearer. Marcus Webb could not be excluded as the biological father of the child Vanessa was carrying. I'd sat on the guest room floor, staring at that document, while my world rearranged itself around this new reality. Ethan, sweet, innocent Ethan, who called me grandma and drew me pictures and saved his Halloween candy to share with me, wasn't David's biological son. The timeline was burned into my memory now. Vanessa and David had started dating in March. By November, she was pregnant, and they were engaged. The hurried winter wedding had followed in December, with everyone pretending the pregnancy was a happy surprise rather than the reason for the rushed ceremony. But according to this test, the baby Vanessa was carrying wasn't David's. It was Marcus Webb's, a name I'd eventually pieced together from other papers in the box. Vanessa's college boyfriend, someone she'd apparently been seeing right up until she'd committed to David. I'd stuffed those papers back into the box with shaking hands, my mind reeling with the implications. David had built his entire identity around being a father. He'd glowed with pride at Ethan's birth, talked endlessly about his son's intelligence, his athleticism, his bright future. Being Ethan's father had given David a sense of purpose and joy I'd never seen in him before. And it was all built on a lie. For 3 years, I'd carried that knowledge like a weight in my chest. 3 years of watching David dote on a child who wasn't his, of seeing Vanessa accept his love and devotion while knowing she'd built their marriage on deception. Why hadn't I told him? At first, I told myself it was for Ethan's sake. He was an innocent child who deserved to have a father who loved him. What good would it do to destroy that bond, to shatter a little boy's security? But if I was honest, truly brutally honest, my reasons had been more selfish than that. I'd known, even then, that Vanessa saw me as a threat. She'd made it clear in countless small ways that my presence in David's life was barely tolerated. If I'd exposed her secret, I would have been seen as the vindictive mother-in-law, the jealous woman trying to destroy her son's happiness. So I'd kept quiet, hoping that my discretion would be rewarded with continued access to David and Ethan. I'd sacrificed my own peace of mind to preserve a relationship that, as it turned out, was doomed anyway. "You fool," I whispered to my reflection in the dark window. "You protected her lies to secure your place in his life, and she drove you out regardless." The irony was devastating. I'd enabled Vanessa's deception, had become complicit in the fraud that was the foundation of David's marriage and fatherhood. And my reward had been yesterday's humiliation. Now David was calling me frantically, needing my help with Ethan, the child who wasn't even his biological son. The child I'd protected by staying silent, allowing him to grow up believing in the security of his father's love. But that love was built on a lie that I'd helped maintain. As dawn broke over my apartment, I made a decision. David had chosen Vanessa over me. He'd cast me out of his life with a cruelty that still made me flinch to remember. If he no longer wanted me as his mother, then I was under no obligation to protect the deception that had shaped his life. For 3 years, I'd been Vanessa's unwilling accomplice. I'd kept her secret, protected her marriage, enabled her to build a life on a foundation of lies. But David had severed our relationship yesterday. He'd made it clear that I was no longer welcome in his family, no longer worthy of basic respect or consideration. If I wasn't his mother anymore, then Vanessa's secrets were no longer mine to keep. The thought filled me with a dark satisfaction that should have frightened me. Instead, it felt like the first honest emotion I'd experienced in years. David wanted to learn what life looked like without his mother's protection. He was about to find out. The pounding on my door began at 7 a.m. sharp. I'd been expecting it, had been waiting for David to exhaust all other options and finally resort to the direct approach. I took my time answering, finishing my coffee and checking my appearance in the hallway mirror. Let him wait. Let him feel what it was like to need something from someone who might not provide it. The pounding continued, desperate and frantic. Through the peephole, I could see David pacing back and forth on my small porch, his expensive clothes wrinkled as if he'd slept in them. When I finally opened the door, I was shocked by his appearance. David looked like he'd aged years overnight. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his face pale and drawn with exhaustion. His eyes were bloodshot and wild with something that looked like panic. This wasn't the composed, successful businessman who dismissed me so coldly 2 days ago. This was a broken man. "Mom," he gasped, as if my name was a prayer. "Thank God. I've been calling you." "I know," I said calmly. I didn't invite him in, didn't step aside to let him enter. 99 calls, I believe. "You counted." His voice cracked with disbelief. "Mom, why didn't you answer? I needed you. I need you." I studied his face with detached interest, noting the fear that had replaced his usual confidence.
Do you?
"Because 2 days ago, you made it very clear that you don't need me for anything. In fact, you made it clear that my presence was an embarrassment to you." David's face crumpled like a child's. "Mom, please. This isn't the time for... For what? For remembering how you treated me? For holding you accountable for your actions?" My voice remained perfectly calm, but I could feel steel beneath the surface. "When exactly would be the appropriate time for that conversation, David?" "It's Ethan," he said desperately, his voice breaking completely.
He's sick, Mom.
"He's really sick and I don't know what to do." For the first time since opening the door, I felt a crack in my composure. Whatever games were being played between David and me, Ethan was an innocent child. My grandson, even if not by blood. "What's wrong with him?" I asked, my voice softening slightly despite myself. "Leukemia," David whispered, and the words seemed to tear at his throat. "Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The doctors found it 2 days ago when we took him to the ER for what we thought was just a stomach bug. The same day he'd turned me away from his door. While I'd been crying over his rejection, my grandson had been receiving the most terrifying diagnosis a parent could hear. He needs a bone marrow transplant," David continued, tears streaming down his face now. "We've tested everyone. Me, Vanessa, her parents, her sister. None of us are matches. The doctors put him on the registry, but they said it could take months to find a donor, and he might not have months." I stepped back from the door, suddenly needing air, space to think. David followed me into my small living room, and I was struck by how out of place he looked surrounded by my modest furniture and second-hand decorations. "What does this have to do with me?" I asked, though something cold was already forming in my stomach. "They tested you," David said, falling to his knees in front of my chair. 3 years ago, when you volunteered for that bone marrow drive at your church. Your information is still in the system, Mom." His voice broke completely. "You're a match. You're the only match they've found." The words hit me like a physical blow. I was a match for Ethan's sweet, innocent Ethan, who wasn't even my biological grandson. The child I'd helped protect by keeping Vanessa's secret all these years. "Please, Mom," David begged, his hands reaching toward me like a supplicant before an altar. "I know I hurt you. I know I was terrible to you at the party. I was wrong and I'm sorry, but right now none of that matters. Ethan is dying, and you're the only one who can save him." I looked down at my son, my successful, accomplished son who had everything he'd ever wanted and more than I'd ever dreamed of having. He was kneeling before me like a beggar, desperate for my help after years of taking me for granted. Now you remember I'm your mother, I said quietly. I never forgot. Didn't you? My voice turned sharp. Because 2 days ago, you told me I wasn't needed. You said you already had a mother at your party. Vanessa's mother, remember? The one who is so much more suitable for your social circle than your own flesh and blood. David flinched as if I'd slapped him. I was an ass, okay? I was worried about Vanessa being upset about her mother's feelings, but not about mine. No, he admitted, his voice small and broken. Not about yours.
I took you for granted, Mom.
I treated you like you'd always be there no matter how badly I behaved. I know I don't deserve your help now, but Ethan does. He's innocent in all this. I stood and walked to my window, looking out at the street where David's expensive car sat among my neighbor's modest vehicles. The irony wasn't lost on me. I, who had no biological connection to the child, was the only person who could save him. What did Vanessa say when she learned I was the only match? I asked without turning around. David was quiet for so long that I turned to look at him. His face was flushed with what looked like shame. She said it was God's way of punishing us, he admitted finally, for treating you badly. How enlightened of her, I said dryly. And what did you say? I said she was right. I said we'd both been horrible to you, and now we needed to beg for your forgiveness and your help. In that order? David looked confused. What do you mean? I mean, are you asking for my forgiveness because you genuinely realize you were wrong, or because you need something from me? The question hung in the air between us. I watched David struggle with it, his face cycling through emotions as he tried to find the right answer. The honest answer. I don't know, he said finally, and for the first time in years, I believed he was telling me the truth. I thought I was sorry before, but maybe I was just sorry that there were consequences. Maybe I only really understood how much I'd hurt you when I realized I might lose you forever. It wasn't the answer I'd wanted to hear, but it was probably the most honest thing David had said to me in years. At least you're being truthful, I said. That's more than I expected. I walked back to my chair and sat down, studying his desperate face. He looked so much like the little boy I'd raised, the child who'd come to me with his problems and trusted me to fix them. Except this time, the stakes were infinitely higher than a skinned knee or a failed test. I'll need to think about it, I said finally. David's face went white. Mom, please. There isn't time to think. Ethan starts chemotherapy tomorrow, and the doctors say the sooner we can do the transplant, the better his chances. I said I need to think about it. I repeated firmly. After 33 years of saying yes to you immediately, automatically, without question, I think I deserve at least one night to consider my options. Your options? David's voice rose in panic. Mom, this is Ethan we're talking about. Your grandson. You love him. Yes, I do, I said quietly. I love him very much. But I'm not sure how much that love is worth to you and Vanessa. I stood up and walked to my front door, opening it in a clear dismissal. David scrambled to his feet, panic written across his features. Mom, wait. Come back tomorrow evening, I said. We'll talk then. But tomorrow, David. And when you come back, bring Vanessa with you. If I'm going to consider saving her son, I think she and I need to have a conversation first. David started to protest, then seemed to think better of it. He nodded reluctantly and walked toward the door. Mom, he said when he reached the threshold, I really am sorry. For all of it. I looked at him for a long moment, this man I'd raised with my own hands, my own sacrifice, my own dreams. I know you are, I said finally. The question is whether sorry is enough. I closed the door softly behind him and leaned against it, listening to his footsteps retreating down my walkway. Through my window, I watched him sit in his car for several minutes before finally driving away. For 33 years, I'd been the solution to David's problems. Tomorrow night, I would discover what he was willing to sacrifice to keep that arrangement intact. And for the first time in our relationship, I would be the one setting the terms. The next evening, I dressed for war. I chose my black dress, the one I'd worn to my mother's funeral 5 years earlier, but had rarely worn since. It made me look austere, dignified, and slightly intimidating, perfect for what I had planned. At exactly 7 o'clock, I heard David's car pull into my driveway. Through my window, I watched him walk around to the passenger side and open the door for Vanessa, who emerged looking like she was attending her own execution. Vanessa had always been beautiful in that carefully maintained way of wealthy women: perfect highlights, professional manicures, designer clothes that never seemed to wrinkle. Tonight, though, she looked haggard. Her usually flawless makeup couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes, and her hands shook slightly as she followed David up my walkway. I waited for them to knock, counting slowly to 30 before opening the door. Let them stand there. Let them feel what it was like to wait for someone else's pleasure. David. Vanessa, I said when I finally answered. No smile, no warmth, none of the automatic hospitality that would have been natural just a week ago.
Come in.
I led them to my small living room and gestured to the couch while I took my favorite chair, the one my mother had left me, the one I'd reupholstered twice but couldn't bear to replace. From here, I could see both their faces clearly. How is Ethan? I asked because despite everything, I genuinely cared about the answer. David's voice caught. He's starting chemotherapy. The doctors want to begin the process as soon as possible, assuming. He looked at me hopefully. Assuming we can find a donor. You've found a donor, I said calmly. The question is whether she's willing to help. Vanessa stirred for the first time since entering my apartment. Of course you're willing to help. He's your grandson. I turned my attention to her, this woman who'd systematically erased me from my son's life. She was still beautiful, even with exhaustion and fear etched in her features. But there was something else there too, an entitlement that made my blood simmer. Is he? I asked quietly. Vanessa went very still. David looked between us, confusion clear on his face. What do you mean? David asked. I said, keeping my voice conversational, that before I agree to undergo a major medical procedure to save a child, I think I deserve to know exactly where I stand in this family. Because just 3 days ago, I was told I wasn't welcome in your home. I was told you already had a mother and that my presence was an embarrassment. David winced. Mom, I explained. You explained that you were worried about Vanessa's feelings, I interrupted. About her mother's feelings. But what about my feelings, David? What about the woman who raised you single-handedly for 33 years? The silence that followed was deafening. Vanessa had gone pale, her manicured hands clutched in her lap. David opened and closed his mouth several times, but no words came out. I have conditions, I announced. Conditions? Vanessa's voice was sharp with disbelief. Your grandson is dying, and you want to negotiate? My grandson, I repeated slowly, whom I apparently embarrass. My grandson, whose family gatherings I'm not welcome at. My grandson, whose parents have made it clear that I'm not really part of his life. I leaned forward, fixing both of them with a steady stare. If I'm going to undergo surgery to save Ethan's life, I need to know that it won't be the last time I'm allowed to see him. I need to know that my sacrifice will be acknowledged and respected. What do you want? David asked quietly. I had prepared for this moment, had spent the entire day thinking about what justice looked like after 33 years of being taken for granted. First, I said, I want a public apology. In front of your friends, your neighbors, everyone who witnessed my humiliation at your party. I want you to acknowledge what you did and express genuine remorse for it. David nodded quickly. Of course, I can do that. Second, I continued, I want honesty in this family. Complete honesty. No more lies, no more secrets, no more deception. Vanessa went very still, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. Third, I want to promise that I will never again be excluded from family events. I want my role as Ethan's grandmother acknowledged and respected. Yes, David said eagerly. Absolutely. Anything you want. I'm not finished, I said coldly. Fourth, I want Vanessa to apologize to me. Not just for the party, but for years of making me feel unwelcome in my own son's life. Vanessa's face flushed red. I never. You never what? I asked. Never made snide comments about my clothes? Never seated me at the children's table at family dinners? Never forgotten to invite me to important events? Never made it clear that you thought David could do better than the working-class woman who raised him? That's not. Vanessa started, then stopped, perhaps recognizing that denials would be pointless. And finally, I said, standing up and walking to where I kept my important papers, I want complete transparency about Ethan's medical history. I returned to my chair with a manila folder in my hands. Both David and Vanessa were staring at it as if it were a loaded gun. You see, I said, opening the folder and pulling out a familiar document, I have some concerns about genetic compatibility. And after some research, I discovered some interesting information. Vanessa had gone white as a sheet. Where did you get that? From your guest room, I said calmly. 3 years ago, when I was babysitting Ethan. You really should be more careful about where you store sensitive documents. David looked between us, confusion clear on his face. What are you talking about? What document? I held up the paternity test, watching as David's eyes focused on the letterhead, the names, the damning results printed in black and white. A paternity test, I said quietly, dated 2 months before your wedding, proving that Marcus Webb is Ethan's biological father, not you. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the tick of my old clock on the mantelpiece, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the sound of David's world crumbling around him. That's not. David started, then stopped.
His face had gone chalk white.
That can't be right. Oh, it's right, I said. I've kept this secret for 3 years, David. 3 years of watching you love a child who isn't yours, watching you build your identity around being a father to a boy whose real father is someone else entirely. David turned to look at Vanessa, and I saw the exact moment when her expression told him everything he needed to know. Is it true? He whispered. Vanessa's composure finally cracked. Tears began streaming down her perfect face, ruining her careful makeup. David, I can explain. Is it true? He repeated, his voice rising. Yes, she sobbed. Yes, it's true. Marcus and we were together right before I met you. I thought it was over, but then when I found out I was pregnant, I wasn't sure. So you took a test, David said slowly, as if working through a difficult equation. And when you found out the baby wasn't mine, you decided to marry me anyway? I loved you, Vanessa protested. I chose you. Marcus didn't want children, didn't want responsibility.
But you did.
You were so excited about being a father. Based on a lie. David exploded, jumping to his feet. Everything has been based on a lie. He turned to me, his face a mask of betrayal and confusion. You knew? You knew all this time. I did, I admitted. And I kept your wife's secret because I thought it would protect your happiness. I thought it would protect Ethan's security. But you're telling me now, David said. Why now? I looked at him steadily. Because you made it clear that I'm not part of your family anymore. If I'm not Ethan's grandmother in any way that matters to you, then I have no obligation to protect the lies that made you his father. The truth hung in the air between us, ugly and undeniable. David sank back onto the couch, his head in his hands. Vanessa continued to cry, her sobs the only sound in the room. "So you see," I continued calmly, "my conditions aren't really negotiations. They're statements of fact. If you want my help, if you want me to save the life of a child who isn't even my biological grandson, then you're going to treat me with the respect I should have received all along." David looked up at me, his eyes filled with a pain that made me almost feel sorry for him. Almost. "You kept this from me for 3 years," he said. "How is that any different from what Vanessa did?" "The difference," I said quietly, "is that I kept her secret to protect you. She kept it to protect herself. I was willing to live with the knowledge that my daughter-in-law had deceived my son because I thought the truth would destroy your happiness. She was willing to build your entire marriage on a foundation of lies." I leaned forward, making sure both of them could see the resolve in my eyes. "But you threw away my protection when you threw me away, David. You can't treat someone like they don't matter and then expect them to keep your secrets." Vanessa looked up from her hands, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "So what happens now?" "Now," I said, "you both decide how much Ethan's life is worth to you. If you agreed to my conditions, all of them, then I'll undergo the procedure to save him. If not," I shrugged, "find another donor." "There is no other donor," David said desperately. "Then I suppose you'd better start making some decisions," I replied. The power dynamic in my small living room had shifted completely. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one begging to be included. I wasn't the one making sacrifices without recognition or reward. For the first time in my adult life, I was the one holding all the cards. And I intended to play them perfectly. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and broken dreams. David and Vanessa had agreed to my conditions, though not without a fight that had lasted until well past midnight. Vanessa had tried tears, manipulation, and finally rage, but I'd remained unmoved. David had pleaded, bargained, and eventually capitulated with the hollow-eyed desperation of a man who'd lost everything in a single evening. Now, 3 days later, we sat in Dr. Martinez's office as he went over the final details before the transplant procedure. I was scheduled for surgery the following morning, assuming all the final tests came back clear. "There's one more test we need to run," Dr. Martinez said, consulting his tablet. "A final paternity confirmation. It's standard procedure to verify the family relationship between donor and recipient, especially in cases where genetic compatibility is so precise." I felt rather than saw Vanessa stiffen beside me. David, who had been staring at his hands for most of the appointment, looked up sharply. "Is that really necessary?" Vanessa asked, her voice carefully controlled. "We're not related by blood anyway. She's David's mother, not mine." "Actually, it is necessary," Dr. Martinez replied. "Your insurance has some very specific requirements about family donors, and we need to document the exact relationship for our records." I watched this exchange with fascination. Even now, faced with her son's life hanging in the balance, Vanessa was still trying to maintain her elaborate deception. "Of course," I said smoothly. "Whatever tests you need to run, doctor. I have nothing to hide." The look Vanessa shot me could have melted steel, but I simply smiled and turned my attention back to the doctor. "Excellent," Dr. Martinez said. "We'll just need a cheek swab from David and Ethan for comparison. Standard procedure." Within an hour, the tests were complete and sent to the lab. Dr. Martinez assured us we'd have results by that afternoon. As we sat in the hospital cafeteria afterward, the tension between the three of us was thick enough to cut with a knife. David hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to Vanessa since the revelation 3 days ago. She, meanwhile, seemed to be swinging between defiance and desperation. "You don't understand," Vanessa said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I never meant for any of this to happen. When I found out I was pregnant, I was terrified. Marcus made it clear he didn't want to be a father. But David..." She looked at him with something that might have been genuine affection. David was so happy about the baby, so excited about being a dad. So you decided to let me raise another man's child without telling me, David said flatly. I decided to give my child the father he deserved, Vanessa shot back. Marcus would have been a disaster as a parent. You were perfect. Perfect enough to lie to for 6 years? Perfect enough to love, Vanessa said, tears starting again. David, you are Ethan's father in every way that matters. You're the one who walked the floor with him when he had colic. You're the one who taught him to ride a bike. You're the one who reads him bedtime stories every night. I watched this exchange with a mixture of fascination and disgust. Even now, even after being caught in her deception, Vanessa was trying to rewrite history to make herself the victim. The DNA won't lie, I said quietly. No, David agreed. It won't. Dr. Martinez found us in the cafeteria just after 2 o'clock, his expression carefully neutral in the way that doctors perfect when they're about to deliver difficult news. I have the results, he said, sitting down across from us. As we suspected, Mrs. Genkins, you are indeed an excellent match for Ethan. However, he paused, glancing between David and Vanessa. The paternity test shows that David is not Ethan's biological father. Even though we'd all known this was coming, hearing it confirmed by medical science hit like a physical blow. David closed his eyes, his face crumpling with pain. Vanessa let out a sob that sounded like it had been torn from her chest. I'm sorry, Dr. Martinez continued gently. I know this is difficult news. However, it doesn't change our treatment plan. Mrs. Genkins is still an excellent donor candidate, and Ethan still needs this transplant urgently. After he left us alone with the wreckage of our family secrets, David finally looked directly at Vanessa for the first time in days. 6 years, he said quietly. 6 years I've believed he was mine. 6 years I've planned his future, worried about his health, been proud of his accomplishments. And all of it was based on a lie. It wasn't a lie, Vanessa insisted. Your love for him isn't a lie. His love for you isn't a lie. The only lie is in his genetics, and that doesn't change anything that really matters. It changes everything, David said. It changes the foundation of our entire marriage. He turned to me then, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before, a complete loss of the certainty that had always defined him. You knew, he said. For 3 years. You watched me love a child who wasn't mine, and you said nothing. I said nothing because I loved you, I replied, because I thought the truth would destroy your happiness. And now? I considered the question carefully. Now I realize that happiness built on lies isn't really happiness at all. It's just delayed pain. David leaned back in his plastic chair, looking older than his 39 years. So, what happens now? Do I just stop loving him? Do I walk away because we don't share DNA? That's up to you, I said. But whatever you decide, you need to decide it based on truth, not deception. I can't just turn off 6 years of being his father, David said. No, I agreed. You can't. But you can decide whether you want to continue being his father knowing the truth, or whether Vanessa's deception has poisoned that relationship beyond repair. Vanessa looked between us desperately. David, please. We can work through this. We can. Can we? David asked. Can we work through 6 years of you lying to my face every single day? Can we work through the fact that you let me believe I was a father when I wasn't? Can we work through the fact that our entire marriage started with you manipulating me into thinking I'd gotten you pregnant? Vanessa had no answer for that. None of us did. There's one more thing, I said quietly. The doctors need to know Ethan's complete medical history for the transplant. That means contacting his biological father. Vanessa went white.
No.
Absolutely not. It's not your choice anymore, I said. If you want me to save Ethan's life, then we do this completely and honestly. No more secrets, no more lies. That was one of my conditions, remember? David looked at me with something that might have been respect. You really meant it, didn't you? About the honesty? I meant every word, I said. I'm done being an accomplice to other people's deceptions. As we sat there in that sterile hospital cafeteria, I felt a strange sense of peace. For 33 years, I'd enabled other people's choices, even when those choices hurt me. I'd kept Vanessa's secret, endured David's neglect, accepted Vanessa's condescension, all in the name of preserving family harmony. But harmony built on lies wasn't really harmony. It was just silence in the face of injustice. Now, finally, the truth was out. Ugly, painful, devastating truth, but truth nonetheless. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe freely. That evening, I walked alone through the pediatric ward of Children's Hospital. The hallways were decorated with cheerful murals and cartoon characters, but nothing could disguise the underlying sadness of this place. Behind each door was a child fighting battles no child should have to fight, families holding onto hope with desperate fingers. I found Ethan's room at the end of the hall. Through the small window, I could see him lying in the hospital bed, small and pale against the white sheets. Various machines beeped and hummed around him, monitoring his vital signs, feeding medicine into his tiny body. I stood there for a long moment, gathering my courage. This child, who wasn't my biological grandson, whose parents had built their relationship on lies, who had become the center of a family drama that would reshape all our lives, this child was still the little boy who'd draw me pictures and saved his Halloween candy for me. I knocked softly and entered when I heard his weak voice call out, "Come in, Grandma." Ethan's face lit up despite his obvious exhaustion. He tried to sit up in bed, but I gently pressed him back down. "Easy, sweetheart," I said, pulling a chair close to his bedside. "How are you feeling?"
Tired, he admitted.
"The medicine makes me sleepy. But Daddy said you might be able to help make me better." My heart clenched at the hope in his voice, at the trust that shone from his eyes. This child had no idea of the chaos swirling around him, the revelations that had shattered his parents' marriage, the conditions I'd imposed on saving his life. "I'm going to try," I said, reaching out to smooth his hair. "Are you scared?" Ethan considered this with the seriousness that children bring to important questions. "A little," he said finally, "but not too much. Daddy says you're the bravest person he knows." The words hit me like a physical blow. David, despite everything that had happened between us, had told his son that about me. "Do you know what brave really means?" I asked. Ethan shook his head, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Brave doesn't mean you're not scared," I explained. "Brave means you do the right thing even when you are scared, even when it's hard." "Are you scared, Grandma?" I thought about the surgery I'd agreed to undergo, about the risks involved, about the uncertain future that lay ahead for all of us. "Yes," I said honestly. "I'm a little scared, but I'm going to do it anyway, because I love you." Ethan smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him since entering the room. "I love you too, Grandma. More than ice cream." I laughed despite myself. "More than ice cream? That's a lot." "More than ice cream and cartoons and staying up late," Ethan said solemnly. "That's how much." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, his small hand in mine. I thought about all the Sunday afternoons we'd spent together, all the stories I'd read to him, all the scraped knees I'd kissed better. Those moments had been real, regardless of genetics or deception. "Grandma?" Ethan's voice was getting drowsy from the medication. "Are Mommy and Daddy fighting because of me?" The question pierced through all my anger and need for revenge. This child, fighting for his life, was worried that he was the cause of his parents' problems. "Oh, sweetheart," I said, leaning closer. "None of this is your fault. Not one bit. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes have consequences. But you didn't cause any of this. Promise. I promise, I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. You are a good boy, and you are loved, no matter what happens between the adults. Ethan's eyes were starting to close, but he fought to stay awake. Will you tell me a story? I thought about all the fairy tales I'd told him over the years, all the adventures we'd imagined together. But tonight called for something different. Once upon a time, I began. There was a little boy who was braver than any knight or superhero. This boy had to fight dragons that lived inside his body, dragons that tried to make him sick. Like me? Ethan whispered. Just like you, I confirmed. And this brave little boy had a grandmother who would do anything to help him fight those dragons, even if it meant being brave herself. What did she do? She gave him part of herself, I said. She gave him her strength, her courage, and her love. And together, they defeated the dragons and lived happily ever after. By the time I finished the story, Ethan had fallen asleep, his breathing deep and even. I sat there for another hour, watching this child who had changed everything, who had forced truths into the light that might have stayed hidden forever. When I finally stood to leave, I found David standing in the doorway. His face was streaked with tears, and I realized he'd heard at least part of my conversation with Ethan. Thank you, he whispered. I looked at my son. This man who had hurt me so deeply, who had taken my love for granted for so many years, who was now facing the collapse of everything he believed about his life. I'm not doing this for you, I said quietly, so as not to wake Ethan. I'm doing it for him. David nodded, accepting the distinction. I know, and I understand why you can't forgive me yet. Maybe you never will. Maybe not, I agreed. But that's between you and me. It has nothing to do with that little boy in there. We stood there in the doorway for a moment, looking at the child who wasn't David's son, but who had been loved as one for 6 years. What are you going to do? I asked. About Ethan, I mean. After? David was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with exhaustion and pain. I don't know, he admitted. I can't imagine not being his father. But I also don't know how to get past what Vanessa did. How do you build a relationship on that kind of deception? You don't, I said simply. You either tear it down and build something new and honest, or you walk away. Is that what you're doing with us? Walking away. I considered the question carefully. I'm building something new, I said finally. Something where my love and sacrifice are valued instead of taken for granted. Whether you're part of that or not is up to you. David nodded slowly. What do I have to do? Be better, I said. Be the man I raised you to be, not the man you became when you decided I was an embarrassment. I left him standing in that doorway, staring at the sleeping child who had unknowingly become the catalyst for all our reckonings. Tomorrow, I would undergo surgery to save Ethan's life. Not because David deserved my help, not because Vanessa had earned my forgiveness, but because an innocent child deserved every chance at life I could give him. The rest would sort itself out afterward. The surgery took 4 hours. I remember the anesthesia mask descending over my face, the brief moment of panic as consciousness slipped away, then nothing until I woke up in recovery with a dull ache in my hip and the taste of cotton in my mouth. The procedure went perfectly, Dr. Martinez told me when I was fully awake. We harvested exactly what we needed. Ethan is receiving the transplant as we speak. I nodded, still groggy from the medication but relieved that my part was done. Whatever happened next, I had given that little boy the best chance I could. Your son is in the waiting room, the nurse told me. He's been there since you went into surgery. Just him. Yes, just him. I wasn't surprised. David and Vanessa's marriage was hanging by a thread, and I suspected she was dealing with her own demons right now. The truth about Ethan's parentage had created shockwaves that were still rippling through their family. When they wheeled me back to my room an hour later, David was indeed waiting. He looked exhausted, his clothes wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled. He stood up quickly when he saw me, hope and fear warring in his expression. "Mom, how do you feel?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," I said honestly. "But I'll live." We sat in awkward silence for a while. The weight of everything that had happened between us hung in the air like a physical presence. "The doctors say Ethan's procedure went well too," David said finally. "Now we wait to see if his body accepts the transplant." "It will," I said with a confidence I didn't entirely feel. "He's a fighter." "Like his grandmother," David said quietly. I looked at him sharply. "I'm not his grandmother anymore, remember? You made that very clear." David flinched as if I'd struck him. "Mom, You what? You didn't mean it? You were just saying it to hurt me?" I shifted in the hospital bed, wincing at the pain in my hip. "Because it worked, David. Congratulations." "I was wrong," he said, and for the first time, I heard something in his voice I'd never heard before, genuine remorse, not just regret at the consequences of his actions. "I was cruel and ungrateful and wrong." "Yes, you were. I took you for granted for so many years that I forgot what it felt like to truly need you. I thought you'd always be there, no matter how I treated you." "I was always there," I said, "until you made it clear that there wasn't where you wanted me to be." David dropped his head into his hands. "I know. And I know that saying sorry doesn't fix any of it. I know I've probably lost you forever." I studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulative boy who'd learned to say whatever he thought I wanted to hear. But all I saw was a broken man who was finally facing the cost of his choices. "You haven't lost me forever," I said finally, "but you've lost the version of me who would sacrifice her dignity for your approval. That woman is gone, David. She died the day you turned me away from your door." "Then who are you now?" It was a good question, one I'd been asking myself for the past week. Who was Amara Genkins when she wasn't defined by her devotion to an ungrateful son? "I'm someone who knows her worth," I said. "Someone who expects to be treated with respect. Someone who won't enable other people's bad choices just to keep the peace." David nodded slowly. Can I try to earn your forgiveness?"
"You can try," I said.
"But it won't be easy, and it won't be fast. And it will require you to actually change, not just promise to change." "What do I have to do?" I thought about all the years of small humiliations, all the times I'd bitten my tongue to preserve family harmony, all the sacrifices that had gone unacknowledged. "You have to mean it when you apologize," I said. "Not just to me, but to everyone who witnessed what you did. You have to acknowledge that your behavior was wrong, not just unfortunate." "I will." "You have to rebuild your relationship with me from scratch. No more assumptions about my availability. No more taking my help for granted. If you want me in your life, you have to actually include me, not just tolerate my presence." "Yes." "And you have to figure out what kind of father you want to be to Ethan. Because that little boy is going to need stability and love, regardless of whose DNA he carries." David was quiet for a long moment. "What would you do? If you were in my position?" "I'd remember that love is a choice, not just a feeling," I said. "You chose to love Ethan for 6 years before you knew about his parentage. The question is whether Vanessa's deception is enough to make you stop choosing him." "It's not," David said without hesitation. He's my son in every way that matters. I can't imagine not being his father." "Then don't let Vanessa's mistakes punish an innocent child." "What about my marriage?" I considered this carefully. "That's between you and Vanessa. But if you're asking my opinion, I'd say you can't build a marriage on lies. Either you find a way to forgive her deception and create something honest going forward, or you don't." She says she loves me. Maybe she does. But she also deceived you for 6 years. Those things can both be true. David leaned back in his chair, looking older than his 39 years. How did everything get so complicated? It got complicated when people started choosing comfort over truth, I said. Vanessa chose the comfort of your love over the difficulty of honesty. You chose the comfort of Vanessa's approval over loyalty to your mother. I chose the comfort of keeping secrets over the pain of confrontation. And now we all have to live with the consequences of those choices. A nurse knocked on the door then, interrupting our conversation. Mrs. Genkins? There's a little boy who's very eager to see you. The doctor says he's doing well enough for a short visit. My heart jumped. Ethan? He's been asking for his grandmother every few minutes since he woke up. I looked at David, and for the first time in years, I saw genuine gratitude in his eyes. Thank you, Mom, he said quietly, for saving him, for loving him, for being better than I deserve. As they wheeled me down the hall to see Ethan, I reflected on David's words. I was better than he deserved, but more importantly, I was finally becoming someone I could respect. And that, I realized, was worth more than all his approval ever had been. 6 months later, I stood on the balcony of my new apartment overlooking the ocean. The view was spectacular, endless blue water stretching to the horizon, sailboats dotting the waves like white butterflies. It was nothing like the cramped apartment where I'd spent so many years, nothing like the neighborhood where I'd raised David in quiet desperation. This was what freedom looked like. The money had come from an unexpected source, a life insurance policy my mother had maintained without telling me, one that had been gaining value for decades. When the lawyer had called to inform me of the inheritance, I'd been stunned. Enough money to change my life, to finally live for myself instead of just surviving for someone else. I'd moved to the coast within a month, found this beautiful apartment with its ocean views and sense of possibility. For the first time in my adult life, I was living somewhere because I wanted to, not because it was what I could afford after taking care of everyone else's needs first. My phone buzzed with a text message. David, as he did every morning now, checking in on me.
Good morning, Mom.
How are you feeling today? Ethan has a doctor's appointment this afternoon, his 3-month post-transplant checkup. I'll call tonight with the results if you'd like. I smiled as I typed back. I'd like that. Give him my love. Our relationship was still fragile, still being rebuilt one careful conversation at a time. David had kept his word about the public apology. He'd called all the guests from that 4th of July party, explaining his behavior and expressing genuine remorse. He'd also made good on his promise to include me in family events, though there weren't many of those anymore. David and Vanessa had divorced 3 months ago. The revelation about Ethan's parentage had been the final nail in the coffin of their marriage, though I suspected it had been dying long before that. They were working on a custody arrangement that would allow David to continue being Ethan's father while Vanessa dealt with her own demons. Surprisingly, Marcus Webb had wanted nothing to do with his biological son when the truth finally came out. He'd provided the necessary medical history, but had made it clear that he had no interest in a relationship with Ethan, which meant that David, for all practical purposes, remained the only father Ethan had ever known. As for Vanessa, she tried to reach out to me several times in the months following the transplant. Attempts at apology, at explanation, at somehow making amends for years of treating me like an inconvenience. I'd listened politely, and then made it clear that while I held no active ill toward her, I also had no interest in a relationship with her. Some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt, and I was at peace with that. The doorbell rang, interrupting my morning meditation. I opened the door to find my neighbor Sarah, holding a plate of fresh-baked muffins. "Thought you might like these," she said with a warm smile. I was experimenting with a new recipe. Sarah was 73, a retired teacher who'd become one of my closest friends since I'd moved here. She was part of a whole new social circle I'd developed, women who saw me as Amara, not as David's mother or Ethan's grandmother. Women who valued my opinions, my humor, my company for their own sake. "They smell wonderful," I said, accepting the plate. "Would you like some coffee?" I was just watching the morning boats. We sat on my balcony, sharing muffins and idle conversation about nothing more pressing than the weather and the new restaurant opening down the street. It was the kind of simple, genuine friendship I'd never had time for during all those years of single motherhood and devoted grandmothering. After Sarah left, I settled into my favorite chair with my laptop. I'd been working on something for the past few months. Not a memoir exactly, but a collection of thoughts about love, sacrifice, and the difference between the two. A few local magazines had published some of my pieces, and I was surprised to discover that I had a talent for writing, for distilling complex emotions into clear, honest prose. My phone rang just as I was getting into the rhythm of writing. Ethan's voice, bright and excited, filled my small apartment. "Grandma, guess what?" "What, sweetheart?" "The doctor says I'm all better. The transplant worked perfectly, and I don't have to take as many medicines anymore." My heart soared with relief and joy. "That's wonderful news, honey. I'm so proud of how brave you've been through all of this." "Daddy says it's because I have strong genes from my grandma," Ethan said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. We talked for another 10 minutes about his school, his friends, his plans for the weekend. When David took the phone back, his voice was thick with emotion. "Mom, I can't ever thank you enough." "You don't need to keep thanking me," I interrupted gently. "I love that little boy. What I did was never a question." "I know. But I also know that after how I treated you." "David," I said firmly, "we've been through this. You're working to make amends, and I can see the effort you're putting in. That's enough for now." There was a pause, then David's voice, quieter now. "Are you happy, Mom? Really happy?" I looked around my sun-filled apartment, thought about my new friends, my writing, the life I was building for myself at 58 years old. "Yes," I said, and realized I meant it completely. "I am happy. For the first time in decades, I'm genuinely happy." "I'm glad," David said, and I could hear that he meant it too. "You deserve that." After we hung up, I walked back out to my balcony and stood at the railing, watching the waves roll endlessly toward the shore. The ocean had always fascinated me, its power, its persistence, its ability to reshape everything it touched. I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago, the woman who'd spent 33 years defining herself through her son's needs and achievements. That woman had been so afraid of losing David's love that she'd accepted less and less of it, until she was grateful for scraps of attention and basic courtesy. That woman was gone now, worn away like a cliff face by years of steady erosion. What remained was someone stronger, someone who understood that love without respect was just another form of servitude. My phone buzzed with another text, this one from an unknown number. "Vanessa. Amara, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted you to know that I think about what I did every day. I'm in therapy now, trying to understand why I made the choices I made. I know I can never undo the hurt I caused, but I want you to know that I'm genuinely sorry." I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Some apologies came too late to matter. Some relationships couldn't be repaired, only ended with as much grace as possible. I'd learned something important over these past months. Forgiveness didn't require reconciliation. I could release my anger toward Vanessa without welcoming her back into my life. I could forgive David's cruelty while still maintaining boundaries about how he was allowed to treat me going forward. Forgiveness was about freeing myself from the weight of resentment, not about absolving others of the consequences of their actions. As the afternoon sun began to slant across my balcony, I opened my laptop again and began to write. Not about the pain of the past, but about the possibility of the future. About what it meant to discover yourself at 58, to realize that your story was far from over. It took me decades to learn that love is not servitude, I typed. I raised my son to be a man, but I forgot to teach him how to honor his mother. I enabled my daughter-in-law's deceptions because I was afraid of losing my place in their lives, never realizing that my place was being eroded anyway. This is my journey now, not as someone's mother or grandmother, but as myself. I am learning what it means to live for my own happiness, to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided devotion. I am discovering that the best revenge is not destruction, but transformation. Not making others pay for their cruelty, but refusing to let that cruelty define you. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for others to see their worth. I spent 33 years doing exactly that. But worth is not something others bestow upon you. It's something you recognize in yourself. And I am just getting started. As the sun set over the ocean, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. Tomorrow, I would wake up in this beautiful place I'd chosen for myself. I would have coffee with friends who valued my company. I would continue writing, continue building this new life I was creating. David would call, as he did every few days now, genuinely interested in my life rather than just checking me off a list of obligations. He was working hard to become the man I'd raised him to be rather than the man he'd become when he forgot where he came from. Ethan would continue to recover, to grow, to thrive. He would know that his grandmother loved him unconditionally, while also knowing that love had boundaries and expectations. And I would continue this journey of self-discovery, this adventure of learning who Amara Genkins was when she wasn't defined by other people's needs. For the first time in my adult life, I was the author of my own story. Not a supporting character in someone else's narrative, but the protagonist of my own journey. And this story, my story, was just beginning. I stood in the gallery, watching people admire the photographs on the walls. My photographs, black and white images of the ocean in all its moods, from storm-tossed fury to mirror-calm serenity. The local arts council was hosting a show featuring work by emerging artists over 50, and I was surprised to find myself among them. Photography had become my unexpected passion. What had started as a hobby, capturing the endless variety of my ocean view, had evolved into something more serious. I'd taken classes, joined a photography group, spent hours learning about composition and light and the technical aspects of this art form I discovered so late in life. The gallery was filled with friends, Sarah and the other women from my book club, neighbors from my building, fellow photographers from my workshop group. People who knew me as Amara, not as anyone's mother or grandmother. People who celebrated my achievements because they cared about me, not because they were obligated to. "Excuse me, are you the photographer?" I turned to see a young woman, probably in her 30s, studying one of my favorite pieces, a shot of waves crashing against rocks during a winter storm. "I am," I said. "This is extraordinary," she said. "There's so much emotion in it. So much power." "Thank you," I said, genuinely touched. That was taken during a particularly difficult storm last winter. Sometimes the most beautiful art comes from the most turbulent moments. She smiled and moved on to the next photograph, and I felt that familiar glow of satisfaction. My work was speaking to people, moving them, making them feel something. At 61, I was discovering talents I'd never known I possessed. "Mom," I turned to see David approaching with Ethan in tow. My grandson, now 9 years old and bursting with health, ran toward me with his arms outstretched. "Grandma, Dad says you're famous now." I laughed and hugged him tightly. "Not famous, sweetheart. Just proud of some pictures I took." "Can I see them?" David and I exchanged a look. Our relationship had stabilized into something healthier than it had ever been before. He called regularly, visited when I invited him, included me in decisions about Ethan's life. More importantly, he listened when I spoke, valued my opinions, treated me with genuine respect. It had taken almost losing me completely for him to remember how to be my son. Of course you can see them, I said, taking Ethan's hand. Let me show you my favorites. We walked through the gallery together, and I explained each photograph to my grandson. David followed quietly, letting Ethan and me have our moment. This one looks angry, Ethan said, studying the storm photograph the young woman had admired. It does, doesn't it? Sometimes the ocean gets very angry, just like people do. But look at this one. I led him to a photograph of the same rocks at sunrise, bathed in golden light. This is the same place, just at a different time. Sometimes, when we're patient, angry things become beautiful. Ethan nodded solemnly, taking in this wisdom with the seriousness children bring to important lessons. After the gallery showing, we went to dinner at my favorite restaurant overlooking the marina. David had grown comfortable with these visits now, no longer awkward or overly apologetic, just grateful for the time we spent together. "How's the writing going?" he asked as we waited for our food. I'd published a collection of essays the previous year, pieces about love, loss, transformation, and the courage required to remake your life in middle age. It hadn't been a bestseller, but it had found its audience among women who recognized their own struggles in my words. "Well," I said, "I've been asked to speak at a conference next month about women reinventing themselves later in life." "That's wonderful, Mom. I'm proud of you." And I could see that he meant it. Not proud because my success reflected well on him, but genuinely happy that I was thriving. "What happened to Vanessa?" I asked. It was a question I rarely asked, but Ethan was in the bathroom, and I was curious. David's expression grew complicated. "She's struggling. The divorce was hard on her, and she's had some problems with drinking. She sees Ethan every other weekend, but..." He shrugged. "I think she's still dealing with the guilt about everything that happened." I felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy. Vanessa's choices had cost her everything: her marriage, her relationship with her son, her sense of herself as a good person. The lies she told to secure her happiness had ultimately destroyed it. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. "Are you? Really?" "Yes," I said. "I'm not glad she's suffering. I just don't feel responsible for helping her anymore." David nodded, understanding the distinction. "She asks about you sometimes. Whether you ever mention her." "What do you tell her?" "The truth. That you've moved on." Ethan returned to the table then, chattering about the boats in the marina, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics. But I found myself thinking about Vanessa's struggles, about the different paths our lives had taken after that terrible revelation. She had tried to build happiness on a foundation of lies and manipulation. When that foundation crumbled, everything built on top of it had collapsed as well. I, on the other hand, had torn down everything that wasn't authentic and rebuilt from the ground up. It had been harder, lonelier, more frightening than I'd expected. But what I'd built was solid, honest, truly mine. As we said goodbye that evening, David hugged me tightly. "I love you, Mom," he said. "And I'm grateful every day that you didn't give up on me completely." "I love you too," I replied. "But more importantly, I love myself now too. And that makes all the difference." Driving home to my apartment, I reflected on how much had changed since that terrible 4th of July 3 years ago. The woman who had stood on David's doorstep, desperately seeking approval and acceptance, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had learned that the most important relationship you can have is with yourself. I parked my car and walked up to my apartment, where my latest photography project waited, a series on women over 50 who had reinvented their lives. Each portrait told a story of transformation, of courage, of the power to become who you were always meant to be. As I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The face looking back at me showed the lines and silver hair of a woman who had lived through struggle and emerged victorious. But more than that, it showed the peace that comes from finally, fully, knowing your own worth. My journey had led me here, to this life I had chosen and built with my own hands, this happiness that belonged entirely to me. It had taken 61 years, but I had finally learned the most important lesson of all. You cannot control how others treat you, but you can control how long you allow that treatment to continue. And sometimes, the greatest act of love is knowing when to walk away. This was my story, my journey, my hard-won freedom, and I was exactly where I belonged. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to choose between your dignity and someone else's approval, then you know this path. It's never too late to choose yourself. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss stories that speak to your soul. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't determined by others' treatment of them. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have set the same conditions? Let me know in the comments below. Remember, you deserve respect. You deserve love that doesn't require you to shrink yourself to receive it. And it's never too late to rewrite your story. Until next time, this is your reminder that the best revenge is living well, and the best life is one you choose for yourself.